Hello, everyone. I thought we would do a live stream today using passive scanning techniques. Generally, when we look at many of the tools out there like Hack the Box or Hack Me or the Capture the Flag events, most everybody starts out with running Nmap, which we would consider an active scanner, which means it actively sends packets out onto the network, and when they come back to the software, it analyzes and makes those nice reports. It gives us a good idea of what's going on the network. The problem is that's probably not really where we'd start in a scenario where we're a penetration tester, whether we're white box or a black box tester, meaning we know about the network or we don't know about the network. The reason for that is Nmap is kind of like a big hammer. As soon as you start it up and run it on a network, it's actively sending packets out. So firewalls, IDS systems, they see those and they can flag that as a attempt on the network or attempt to scan the network. It might shut the scan down. It could do a variety of things, alert somebody at the business that a scan is happening. So if we're a penetration tester, we might first prefer to get a view of the network without alerting anybody that we're actually on the network. Of course, the first step in that is likely going to be some type of reconnaissance. Well, I'm not going to go through the reconnaissance phase here. That's less going to be social engineering. If it is a black box test or if it's a white box test, somebody may have given you a diagram of the network to work with. So obviously, that's not going to be something that we can live stream, but we're going to start from the position of we know or we have a way to connect to the network through our reconnaissance. We've figured that out. And we're going to do a passive scan by utilizing a device called the Packet Squirrel, which is made by Hack5. And if you're not familiar with those people, they have a whole bunch of pretty interesting devices. And I'll put the page up here. And if we scroll down here a little bit, you can see they have many things. And what we're going to be looking at in particular is this one right here, the Packet Squirrel. Most of their devices are pretty fairly priced and give you some good tools to practice with. Of course, I would also say that we're not going to, you shouldn't be doing any type of passive or active scanning on a network that you don't have permission to do so. So for today's little adventure, I have created my own small network here for us to work with. So I'll put this over here and let's pull out the directions for working with the Packet Squirrel. It's a small device. It's about the size of, I guess they say a matchbox, but that might not be the best right now. But in here, it's got several different things. It's got an inside where we have an Ethernet in. So we're going to plug in an RJ45 jack from the target PC. It's powered by USB. It has an Ethernet out on the other side and a spot for a USB storage device. Built into it, it has the ability to run multiple different payloads and an arming mode. Now you can create your own attacks using this as well, but for today's demonstration, I'm simply going to use payload number 1, which is TCP dump, and that is going to be a passive scanning where it's going to collect all the packets that pass through it. And if we were to put the Packet Squirrel on a network, and if it was on the network and we ran, say, an Nmap, an active scan, most likely it's not going to be detected. So it's going to be able to sit on the network and the business organization, IT staff likely won't know it's there. And it's fairly small. So let's put this to use and see how this actually is going to work. So I have set up my little station right here. So here is a live picture of it. You can see I simply have a small laptop computer, and then I have a Netgear router, and right next to that, you can probably see it, there's a small Raspberry Pi sitting there. So they're all connected through the Netgear router, and also on the back side of it, you'll see here in a second, I've got an RJ45 cord connected to it just to make it a little bit easier. So let me get my little Packet Squirrel out here so we can see how this works. So we'll see if it focuses for me. This is the Packet Squirrel. As I said before, it's got one side where we've got an in for USB and an RJ45. On the other side, we've got our USB plug and an out for the Ethernet. It's got a button and a light. And I'm going to use this battery pack. However, if you were doing this for work, you might find a smaller battery pack or find a way to connect the two together. So when I plug this in, let's see if we can get it to focus here. There we go. We can see the little light. Now I recommend starting this up before you plug it into the network. It takes about 30 or 40 seconds to boot up. You can see the lights flashing. But if you plug it into the network and then turn it on, you're going to run the risk of it interrupting service for a longer period of time, and perhaps you may be detected. So according to the directions, once we get this flashing light, this is all booted up and ready to go. So I'm going to go over here to my cord, and I'm going to plug in the out side, and now I'm going to plug in the in from my computer. So there it is. It is now all set up and capturing packets. If you look on the screen of the laptop right now, you can see that it is using an SSH connection to the Raspberry Pi. So it's actively connected to it. And in there, I started Hack5's C2 software, which is running on the Raspberry Pi. So if I go over here to Firefox, here is the website, and just to show you, over here on the just the port 80, it's just running an Apache Debian default page. I also have it running just going through a regular HTTP page so we can connect and collect some of those packets, and the Hack5, which I think might need to be refreshed. There we go. And there's our Hack5 C2 software. And you can even see right now, somewhere on my network, I have a keycrock connected that is collecting information. So now that I've done that, my little device is collecting the information. The next step is to press the button on the back side of this. And when you do that, it's going to write to the USB drive. And now I can reconnect the original computer back up to the network. All right. The next step is to just unplug it. And I'm going to grab the USB out of here and plug it into a computer. So let's go over to our computer here and plug this in and see what happens. All right, so it has detected the USB drive. If I go on to my packet loot, into my loot folder, into TCP dump, you can see that I have several Wireshark capture files. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into those. I am not going to use the capture I just collected because I don't have any idea what it actually captured, and I want to make sure that I don't put things like my public IP address into the live stream. So I'm going to use a previous capture to work with and go through on the live stream here. So I'm going to switch back to this computer, and I'm going to bring up the Wireshark capture. All right, so here is our Wireshark capture from that same little network. And we can get a lot of information off of this capture just by digging through it for a minute. So right now I can see that this capture has about 10,567 packets over 204 seconds approximately. So you can imagine if you had a network with quite a few devices on it and a longer session that you captured the packet for, you would definitely have a lot of information to dig through. So this is not something that's going to, analyzing this file is going to take quite a bit of time to do it accurately. But we'll look through a couple of things in here just to see what kinds of things we captured. And in Wireshark, we can do a few things, but let's start by adding a filter. And we know that we had HTTP traffic. So let's apply a filter and look at that. We also know that our HTTP traffic is going to be in plain text, so we're going to be able to see everything that was transferred in Wireshark here. And if I scroll down in this center section, I'm just on the very first packet, you can see all the information that was sent to begin with. All in plain text. We can see we've got some Firefox things going on here as well. We can see it's the source was 192.168.2.100, and it was going to 34.107.221.82. Now, we could investigate that further, but I'm going to tell you that's an outside website. So that was a website outside of our network. If we go back through a little bit further, we can even see inside the network HTTP right here, which is going to be the source 192.168.2.217 to 2.100. Now, when we have that inside the network, now we can actually see that 192.168.2.217 is likely the Raspberry Pi. See how it looks at the MAC address and makes a guess that it's a Raspberry. So there's our Raspberry Pi MAC address. We have that. We also then have the Raspberry Pi's IP address. In the Toshiba laptop, we have the same thing. We now know for sure it is 192.168.2.100, and we have captured its MAC address as well. So we're well on our way to enumerating some things on this network. And that's just with the HTTP protocol. If we look at some of the other common protocols, such as DHCP, we can see we have very little DHCP traffic. But interestingly, we can see some of the traffic now is related to a different IP address. In fact, it's 2.1, which we did not see on our HTTP traffic. And if we look down here in the center, we can see that the source, the 192.168.2.1, is a piece of Netgear equipment. And we could probably reasonably assume that that Netgear equipment is a router access point all-in-one Soho device. But we can get some more information besides that. Some of the other common protocols we may look at for interesting information would be DNS. it's going to show us not a lot in this network, but 2.1, that is our router. That seems to be where most of the DNS traffic is going to and from. So still tells us, yep, that router is definitely likely connected to the internet as well. If we dive in and look at SSH, which, if you recall, that's how the Toshiba was actually communicating with the Raspberry Pi with SSH traffic. Let's go ahead and filter that out. And here we go. So now we have information about our SSH traffic. And importantly, over here, we can see on this top line exactly what SSH is being used. We can see it's SSH 2.0, OpenSSH 8.4, P1 Debian 5. Well, we now have enumerated the SSH client. We'll want to keep track of that. If we're a penetration tester, we'll keep track of that because we're going to later on look for exploits related to that particular program that we just enumerated. Let's look at one more thing here, and we can see our TLS traffic. And our TLS traffic, we can see, is using version 1.2 and 1.3. Now, if we went and looked we've now enumerated that traffic, there are definitely vulnerabilities for TLS 1.2. So we might have an angle for us to further test on this network. 1.3 is generally pretty good, but 1.2, or if we saw 1.1, would be potentially vulnerable protocols that we could exploit. So let's dig through a little bit more of this on our Wireshark. And if we go and we look at this packet right here, it's packet 129, it's giving us some more information about the Raspberry Pi. We can see we're working with port 22, and down here again, we see SSH 2.0 and OpenSSH 7.9. But now we also see for sure it's running Raspbian 10, Debian 10.2. So we have now enumerated the operating system on the Raspberry Pi. Of course, if we wanted to, then we'd begin looking for vulnerabilities related to that precisely. So we have a really good idea about one of the computers on this network just from this, looking through this passive scan, which again is only about, what, 3 minutes worth of scan, 3.5 minutes worth of a scan. But our Wireshark gives us a lot more information besides that. So if we roll over into the Analyze section and Statistics, if I go down here to IPv4 and I tell it to show me all the destinations and ports, here Wireshark is giving me a very nice list of every IP address and every port that each IP address used. And here, as we dig through it, we know 2.17 is a Raspberry Pi, and we can see 1146, but interesting to us is 8080. And it has some traffic on 8080 that likely we want to know more about. So we'll keep looking. 192.168, 2.100, that is the Toshiba laptop. So we captured absolutely every piece of traffic going in and out of that. Some of this may be interesting, but we can see most of these are higher ports. So we'll come back to that, but that may or may not be interesting. Our router 2.1, we can see we've got port 53, so it has DNS traffic going to it. These other IP addresses are going to be public IP addresses to websites. We would definitely look through them and go to each address if we were doing once we were done, when we're analyzing all this information, we would want to know what each particular website is, because that may give us some other clues about what's going on the network as well. So in our statistics, we can look at all the source and destination addresses, or all the addresses together. Right now that's IPv4. If we slide over to IPv6 and look at the destination and ports, this doesn't have a lot of interesting traffic. In fact, we can just to look at the source and destination addresses. I look at the IPv6 source and destination addresses. What I can see is it's all FE80 and FF05, FF02 on the prefix, which means FF02 and 05 are multicast addresses, so they're not going to a particular computer. And the FE80 are all link local addresses, which means they're self-assigned on each computer. So I can make a pretty reasonable assumption at this point that this network is not using IPv6 for anything. These are just what would be out there normally. Well, let's go and look at our statistics and look at a couple of other interesting things. We already looked briefly at DHCP, but when we look at the analysis of it, over here the number of packets sent are just what we saw and assumed. There's very little DHCP traffic on this network over that time, which means one, there's very few computers likely, or two, everything on the network is got a static IP address. So we don't get a lot of information on that one. If we look at our DNS queries, we have quite a few of those, but most of them aren't doing much. Our IPv6 and our IPv4 queries, there's only a few packets of that, relatively speaking, 26 and 60. So we're not doing a lot of DNS queries, so there's probably not a lot of web traffic on this network. But let's look at the HTTP requests sequences. And this is going to show us some very interesting information. We can see now, remember how I said port 8080 was probably going to be interesting? So now we have 192.168.217 port 8080. And we can actually see some of the file names that have been moved back and forth. So we now know some of the directories that are on that particular on the Raspberry Pi. We may want to go ahead and enumerate them further. We can even see that there's some JavaScript going on. We've got pictures, SVG, right? So this would be something we would definitely look at a lot more closely, perhaps with an active scan or a program that's designed to enumerate websites. All right, so the next thing we'll look at, which is going to give us a whole bunch of information, is this thing called flow graph. And this becomes a very large graph of all the back and forth information. It starts out on this left side showing us IPv6, but let's move over into where we have IPv4. And up here at the top, we can see here is Netgear. So communication with the Netgear over just with its MAC address, and here is its IP address. And now we can see all these DNS queries going back and forth. It's going from 2.1 to 2.100. So we can see the back and forth of the conversations. And if we were enumerating this, we could dive a lot deeper and start making some assumptions about what is happening. So now we can see the Toshiba is communicating with a particular website. Over here, we should have 2.17, and somewhere we're going to definitely have a bunch of information flowing back and forth between it. And here we go. Here's port 22. So here is our SSH. We can even see where the key exchange takes place. So we've got a lot of good information to understand how things are moving. All right. So what are we going to do with all this information? Obviously, it's going to take a while for most people is to work with a template and start to catalog everything you find, because you're not really going to remember it. Analyzing this network. Well, one of the things I want to do is I want to try to create some type of logical network diagram for it. And I may have all the pieces I need. Now, if I'm doing a white box test, someone may have given me this, but if I'm doing a black box test, I definitely want to try to create it. And then I'm going to take these passive scan results as I go through them, and I'm going to just start filling in this table with the IP address, the port, the service enumeration if I get it, any notes, anything I find interesting. The next step, and we're not doing this today, is to start doing an active scan. Or you might decide to do an, well, maybe we'll run a enumeration of one port. So how? Well, I'm not going to have you sit and watch me type for 30 minutes, although that could be entertaining. Here's kind of what I would have done for this. I would have proposed this as a network diagram. I think these connections as dotted lines, because I'm not really sure 100% if there's anything else. I'm still not positive on all. I'm pretty certain. I'm going to go ahead and put the method that I use, the name of the file, and then I'm going to do just what I said. Raspberry Pi 192.168.2.17. Here's the service. I got the MAC address. I got the OS of it right here. I know on port 80 it's running Apache 2. 8080 is a question mark, but it's definitely a website. Saw that is running SSH and open. So I cataloged all that. As I go down, I got just a little bit of information from the router. I could probably make some other assumptions. It looked like it was doing DHC sequence in there to decide if that was for certain. And then 1.1, the 100, the Toshiba, I managed to, it told us it was running Linux, but I didn't capture the exact version of Linux, so it should have shown up as Debian, but I didn't see that in the scans anywhere. We know it was using Firefox 78 was in there, and here's a catalog of all this passive scan results, and then for what might be vulnerable and what I want to actively scan or enumerate, and what might be interesting. And because we use the passive scan idea, the network should not have alerted anyone that we captured all this information. If we're doing a the IT staff shouldn't have noticed at this point that we have captured it, and we can, in effect, we can kind of take our time and determine the next. So that is kind of a quick overview of doing a passive scan on on a network using the Packet Squirrel, and the Packet Squirrel uses TCP dump. We put that into our Wireshark, and we used Wireshark to complete our analysis. All right, so that's all I have for today. I'm not sure if anyone, but I think we're going to wrap this up right here. I appreciate everybody jumping in and participating in the live stream. I'm going to end it here. Of course, eventually it'll be up on YouTube if anyone wants to rewatch it. Thanks again for joining me.